Hey y'all, I'm James Wright and welcome to my shop. Today let's talk about Japanese saws and why you really might want one. Let's make some people angry. There are a few things in the woodworking world as divisive as Western versus Japanese, and a lot of times people think that you've got to choose one or the other, when in reality, do you really need to? Now let me start off by saying I am not a Japanese woodworker. I don't claim to be one. I have spent a lot of time experimenting and playing with it, and I've tried a whole bunch of different things, but I'm not. I predominantly use Western tools, which this is going to be a little odd for me making the argument to use Japanese tools, but I've talked with a lot of Japanese woodworkers and I have several good friends who are predominantly Japanese woodworking, as in the traditional style. I was at Woodworking in America this weekend and had a long talk with Wilbur Pan. He is a great Japanese style woodworker and has a lot of information on these, and it was fascinating to kind of pick his brain and learn a few more things. And there are many reasons why I often suggest, hey, go get a Japanese saw rather than one of the Western saws. First off, this is so much easier to learn. A Japanese saw, when it's used correctly, just cuts, and there really isn't a whole lot of skill involved with it. One of the big reasons is the price. These are incredibly affordable. You can get one with a disposable blade for 20, 30, 40 bucks and get a decent saw that does good work. And it takes the place of 3 or 4 of the Western saws. They have a much thinner plate, and that thin flexible plate means you're removing less material and you're doing less work. On average, it's around 25% thinner than a Western blade, and that means you're doing 25% less work. And that's why most of the times when someone's getting into hand tools and they're first starting out, for beginners, Japanese saws are phenomenal. They do great work, they do it affordably, you can learn it very quickly, and there's just a lot of upsides, particularly for the beginner. On top of that, if you're a solid hybrid woodworker and you're doing most of your work with power tools, you're not going to be using hand saws that often. And in that case, these are a lot better. It's not a skill you have to maintain. It's just something you can pick up and cut. And if you're not going to be using them all that often, these are phenomenal for the hybrid woodworker as well. Wilbur Pan did a demonstration this weekend that was absolutely phenomenal. I wish I could have videoed it, but I don't have the rights to it. But I'll kind of describe what it is. But if you want to, go take a look at his website. It's the Giant Cypress, and I'll leave a link to it down below. But really cool information, particularly on Japanese tools. The cool thing he did is he brought someone up from the audience and said, I want to find someone in the audience who isn't good at saws. They always go off the line, and I just want to find someone who's base knowledge and really doesn't have much skill. And so the guy got the saw and he got up to the board and he started it. Everything was looking good. And then somewhere around 2 inches in, he said, wait, I'm going offline. I'm going offline. How do I fix this? And Wilbur came up and said, yeah, that's to be expected. Do you know why? Because you were using it with one hand. If you're ever cutting with one hand, this side of the body is always trying to get out of the way and you're doing one of these swinging motions. It takes a lot of skill to keep the arm in line with the saw and get a nice clean stroke. And so if you're working with one hand, you just have this natural tendency to move all over the place. And so Wilbur told the guy, wait a second, on this next time I want you to do the exact same thing on the exact same line, and rather than cutting with one arm, bring the second hand in and pull towards your stomach. So after starting it with a one hand, getting it flush in, and just with that instruction and the exact same saw on a slightly different line, he came up to the board and started cutting in towards his stomach. And weird thing was, it tracked right down that line, dead on. And the cool thing is, because it's in the center of your body, you have your eye, both of them, on the line. So you can actually see both sides of the line as you're going down. And as you're pulling in, one arm is counteracting the other. This one having a tendency to pull out this way, this one has a tendency to pull out that way. They equal each other and you pull straight in. You get a nice, clean, easy cut. And it cuts straight down the line. Wilbur said he's done that demonstration dozens of times, and every single time it was the exact same way. A beginner without any skill would cut with one hand and it would go off the line. But as soon as they brought in that second hand, it would go straight down the line. It's phenomenal because it doesn't take much skill at all. You just have to learn the technique you need, 2 hands, and it works beautifully. There's another big benefit to Japanese saws, and that's because they're on the pull stroke, and that means that the leading tooth is on the back side of the saw. The first tooth to enter the cut and actually guide the blade is on the opposite side of the saw, and you have very little control over the tooth on the other side of the board. With a Western saw, you're pushing, and that means the controlling tooth is actually on your side of the saw, so you have way more control over where it's going. That sounds like a good thing for Western saws, but to a beginner, it's not. With a Western saw, you really only use it one-handed. Even if it has a thumb hole in there, you're still going off one side and using it one-handed. It takes more skill because everything has to be in alignment. And if any part of your body is out of alignment, then it's going to start going all over the place. Much faster than a Japanese saw. And because the controlling tooth is on my side of the blade, any small imperfection, any small input I put into it, the saw is going to magnify and it's going to go all over the place, magnifying the problems that are already hard to begin with. With a Japanese saw, because the leading tooth is on the other side, I can do a lot to my end of the saw before it really starts going off. And that's why it takes a lot longer to learn how to use a Western saw. Yes, you can do it. There's a lot of skill involved. Once you have that skill, this thing cuts as straight as an arrow as long as it's set up right. But if you don't want to spend all the time learning the skills, you can pick up a Japanese saw and cut. And that's why it's phenomenal for a beginner, or phenomenal for a hybrid woodworker who's not going to be using them all that often. They just want a saw to make that fine cut. So why exactly do I still use a Western saw? Because once you have the skill for using a Western saw, now you have more control over the saw. With a Japanese saw, because the leading tooth is on the other side, if you want it to do something funky, or if because the grain starts taking it off, it's very, very hard to bring it back into line. Whereas with a Western saw, it's really easy to bring it back into line, and I can guide it exactly where I want, as long as I have the skill. On top of that, cutting on the push stroke gives you more power. You'll hear some people say that your body is better on the pull stroke, or you have more power on the pull stroke, or you have more control on the pull stroke, and you'll hear one or the other, and the answer is that's all kind of phooey. It's one of those things that your body muscle structure has more capability in one way or the other depending upon how you've trained it. You do tend to have more strength in the pull than in the push, but if you're using that much of your strength, you're doing it wrong. See, the benefit to cutting on the push stroke is when you cut downhill, you're actually putting your own body weight into it. The benefit of the pistol grip and cutting on the push stroke allows you to just mechanically be able to put more weight onto the saw, which you don't always want to do. When you're starting off, you want a very light cut. But once you have that line in place and you have the skill, you can put a decent amount of weight into the saw and cut a lot faster. With a Japanese saw, it's actually a little harder to get that same pressure and that same weight. And saws tuned up to the same amount, the Western saw is usually going to cut a little bit faster. Now it's going to take a little more effort because it's about 25% thicker, but most of the time the Western saw is going to cut significantly faster than the Japanese saw. But learning that skill, it's not terribly easy. Now some people take to it really easily, and some people take years of practice to get it down right. And it's one of those things where it may be a sticking point where that's not really great for you. Some people like it, but some people just almost never get the hang of it. Now the other thing we have to talk about is the Japanese saw itself. Now I keep picking up this one, and this is a Ryobi. This is a two-sided saw. One side is rip saw, one side is cross-cut. You'll hear some people say one side is the aggressive cut and one side is the finer cut, and no, it's actually because it's rip cut and cross-cut. It's basically the Japanese equivalent of taking a sash saw and a tenon saw and putting them together. But the rip cut teeth are a little bigger, so it's more like putting a panel saw together with a tenon saw. The Ryobi is basically the jack saw. It's that mid-range, it does most everything saw. Kind of the same way we look at a tenon saw and a sash saw. They both are that general mid-range joinery saw. The Dodzuki, which is a back saw, just like the Western saws, has a much thinner plate, and a lot of people think of this as the dovetail saw, but it's not because it has cross-cut teeth. So this is basically the carcass saw of the Japanese world. And there are a whole bunch of other ones. There are smaller ones that would be closer related to the dovetail saw. There are larger ones like the whaleback saw that's used for resawing, and they come the whole gamut. Just like Western saws, there's a whole bunch of them. But for some reason, all we think about is the Ryobi, and we think that's Japanese saws. They only had the one. Now yes, they use that more than any other, just like we would use a sash saw and a tenon saw more than any other. But they had lots of other saws, just like the Western people do. Now yes, the really high-end classical ones from Japan, they're not hardened and they are not replaceable. You would actually go in and sharpen them. But unless you're willing to spend a lot more than you would spend for most Western saws, you're generally just going to find them with the disposable blades, and that's perfectly fine. They work great. One of these years I'm going to go all in on the Japanese style and create a bench on the floor and have fun doing Japanese the traditional way with all the accoutrements. And I think that would be kind of fun to do for a full year and really focus on Japanese woodworking, because there's a lot of intricacies to it that are a lot of fun. But there are a lot of things that kind of get blown out of proportion. Japanese woodworking does the same things that Western woodworking does. It's just they do it differently because they were closed off for hundreds of years. And in the end, is one better than the other? No, they both have great points and they both have different things, and I talk to different people and I'll suggest one or the other, because even for me, there are times where I will reach for a Japanese saw because I really like it for a particular application. But anytime someone says that a Japanese saw is better than a Western saw, or that a Western saw is better than a Japanese saw, realize that they're wrong, because better is really subjective. It depends on the person, the application, the tool, and so many other things. No one saw is better than another saw. They all have different pros and cons. So all that being said, I'd love to hear from you. What method do you use? Do you prefer one or the other, and why? What are the reasons you really enjoy? There were a lot of things that I glossed over. I'm talking about hundreds and hundreds of years of tradition and comparing from across the world and trying to condense it down into just a few minutes. And yeah, there's a lot I didn't talk about. And maybe we'll do some follow-up videos in the future, but we'll see. Maybe I'll do a whole year where I'll get rid of my bench and work on the floor. Who knows what the future will hold. A lot of fun things could happen. But I'd love to hear your thoughts, questions, ideas, snide remarks. Throw those down below. It does help out the channel. Anytime you like, comment, share, all those things down there. Or even if you just want to leave a snide remark or comment down below with CBD, CDB. Thank you, it means a lot. And I do love reading through those, but if you really want to go even farther and help out this channel, think about joining those people over there. Those are some of the fantastic, wonderful, benevolent, gorgeous people over on Patreon. The woodworkers in my life that I truly enjoy. And without them, we wouldn't be here. You guys are the ones that support this channel, and I get to say what I want to say rather than what some saw company wants to say. And there's a reason why every single saw on this bench was made by a different company. Thank you. Without patrons, I would not be able to do that. If you want to find out more about that, you know what to do. Description down below. I think that'll do it for now. And until next time, have a wonderful day. Japanning. It is the black film coating you'll find on a lot of old tools. But interestingly enough, Japanning will only be found on Western tools. Okay, I'm sorry, that joke didn't quite Japan out.